Welcome to the StrongTeams.com podcast, where we help leaders build strong teams. Teams built on empathy, understanding, and trust, where every team member feels valued and contributes at the highest level possible.
Welcome to the StrongTeams.com podcast. My name is Steve Neesmith.
And I'm Rodney Cox.
And Rodney, I'm excited today. We've got a fantastic guest. Mark Miller is with us today. Mark is with Chick-fil-A. He's a senior executive with Chick-fil-A. His career at Chick-fil-A began more than 40 years ago as an hourly team member in one of their local restaurants. Shortly thereafter, he became the 16th corporate employee working in the warehouse. Over the last 40 years, he served in leadership roles across the business, from corporate communications to restaurant operations to training and development. And currently, Mark serves as the vice president of high performance leadership there at Chick-fil-A. And if that wasn't enough, Mark has authored nearly a dozen books, mostly on leadership. Most recently, I'm hearing on the grapevine that he has a graphic novel coming out on leadership, which I'd love to hear a little bit more about during this interview. But his latest title that we're going to talk about today is Culture Rules, the Leader's Guide to Creating the Ultimate Competitive Advantage. Mark, thanks for joining us today on the StrongTeams.com podcast.
Well, thank you, Steve and Rodney. I'm delighted to be with you.
Wow, Mark, over 40 years. That's impressive. I mean, did you join at 12? I didn't know they allowed people to join the organization at such a young age.
Yeah, I told folks I was a small child. And actually, it's been 45 years. I
my goodness.
just want to tell you the full story. It's been a long time.
Wow, that is so amazing. So tell us a little bit about how you did get to Chick-fil-A and kind of that beginning story. How did you make your way there? And as we start our interview and our guests get to know you a little better.
Well, as Steve mentioned, I did start as an hourly team member in one of our local restaurants. And here's the truth. I was awful. I actually had a strong sense that I was going to be terminated any day. So I made a strategic career decision. Now, I want to be very clear to your audience. This is not career advice, but I quit because the way it worked in my head as a kid, I would rather quit than be fired and then have to explain to people, why my resume, I got terminated at Chick-fil-A because I was just awful. So I quit and I went and got another job. And about 6 months later, I got laid off and I went, I need a job. And I thought, well, I can't do what they do in the restaurant, but those Chick-fil-A people seem nice. So I think I'll go and get a job at their home office, which of course makes no sense at any level, but this is the mind of a kid. So I walked into the home office, told the receptionist I wanted a job in their warehouse because I knew they had a warehouse. And just a few minutes later, Truett Cathy came out, the founder of Chick-fil-A, to conduct the interview, which again, you might think doesn't make any sense, but as Steve mentioned, I was interviewing to be the 16th employee. And if you've only got 15 team members, I'm assuming the head man or the head woman is probably conducting those interviews. And I tell people it was a combination of God's grace and lack of discernment on Truett's part that he gave me that job working in the warehouse. And that was well over 40 years ago.
Wow, that's so amazing. And to make it to VP of High Performance Leadership, I don't know of any other organization that has a title of VP of High Performance Leadership. So leadership must be pretty important to you guys to make that a senior leadership position. So tell us a little bit about what the VP of High Performance Leadership does on a day-to-day basis.
Well, I'll give you just a little bit of the backstory. We believe that leadership has always been our competitive advantage, primarily as embodied in the men and women that operate the restaurants. We call them our operators, and we win or lose based on that local leadership. And about 25 years ago, I began to focus a significant part of my time on how to serve those leaders, how to help them grow and develop, how to help them grow leadership capacity in their organization. And at the same time, how do we help our corporate leadership grow? And so that over time began to occupy more and more of my time until these days I spend about close to 100% of my time trying to figure out how to help us grow leadership capacity.
With this latest book, Culture Rules, you've written many leadership books, obviously. And so what an amazing legacy to be putting in writing and be able to hand to leaders what it takes to create a strong culture, built on empathy, understanding, and trust. And it's kind of our hallmark. If you done any research on our background, that's what we're about the business of, is building strong teams, through strong leaders. So tell us, this Culture Rules book, tell us a little bit more about the book. Why did you name it Culture Rules, and kind of what's the thesis of the book? What's the bottom line?
Okay, so there's a lot in that question, but I want to give you just a little bit of context, because I think it'll help set up why this book and why now. As I said, I started focusing more and more of my time and energy on serving our leaders a quarter of a century ago. Mm-hmm. And what we try to do is identify emerging or near-term issues or challenges, things that are on the horizon or perhaps just over the horizon. And we have a lot of people in our business that are dedicated to serving the operators today. But we said we want to try to anticipate. We want to try to, again, meet them as they enter their next challenge, which you'd be interested to know. We did that with the topic of teams many years ago. We saw a lot of operators struggling with leadership capacity, and we realized they were trying to provide all of the leadership capacity themselves. And so we began to research and advocate for building leadership teams as a strategy to grow leadership capacity. And I mention that because when we started talking about that in earnest, we probably didn't have 5% of the businesses, the operators that had leadership teams. So that's an example of us trying to just get ahead of the business, cast some vision, do some equipping, form a point of view that would potentially be helpful for them as we move into the future. And we've done that a dozen times or so over the last 25 years. Again, that look into the near-term future, what can we anticipate and how can we serve them? So with that context, a few years ago, we began to see issues, concerns, maybe even a few cracks as you think about this topic of culture. And then, of course, COVID hit. And the pandemic, as I'm sure all of your listeners would agree, put a lot of pressure on organizations.
Absolutely.
It put pressure on cultures. And that pressure does a couple of things. Pressure reveals both strengths and weaknesses. Mm-hmm. And we decided that culture was going to be our next topic. Again, made this call a couple of years back because we also had the pressure of growing volume, growing complexity, just a more complex world in which we're trying to do business. So you take all of that, the pandemic, and we feel very, very fortunate that we chose to explore this topic of culture and have been able to release our point of view. So that for context, let me go to your specific question. If we want to serve operators and we want to help them strengthen their culture, and not just operators, but leaders around the world, if we want to help them strengthen their culture, we needed an informed point of view. And so as we have done many times over the years, we began to do research on whatever the topic of the day is. And in the case of culture, we did a global survey. We ended up either interviewing, including in focus groups or in quant survey, over 6,000 folks, senior level, mid-level leaders, and frontline associates from 10 countries. And we were in search of what is universally true about culture. And then again, as our process dictates, once we know what's true, we try to translate it into a form that is applicable and it's approachable and something that will work. And that's really the premise of the book. We wanted to provide action steps that leaders could take to create strong, vibrant, dynamic, high-performance cultures.
Mark, that immediately impressed me about this book. Early on, you mentioned that you surveyed thousands and thousands of folks in the field, and that data informed the content of this book. So, kudos to you for doing that. That's not done oftentimes with a lot of the leadership content that's out there. You also talked about all the leaders that you now have to cultivate throughout a large organization that scales at the level that you do. And I recall that early on in the book, you write about several things that you wish you had known as a young leader about to enter the game. Can you tell our listeners just a little bit about what those things were?
Well, I would probably summarize it and say I wish I had known how important culture was. I mean, today it's pretty obvious, but that's with a lot of hindsight. And I would encourage young leaders to give a lot more attention, focus, and priority to the topic of culture. I mean, it's not a new idea. Peter Drucker said probably 50, 60 years ago that culture eats strategy for breakfast.
I love that quote.
It's a great
It's still
quote.
true. It's still true. But I think as a young leader, I was thankful that I was in a healthy culture, and I probably had an awareness of that, but I didn't think nearly enough about how I could strengthen that culture, how I could promote that culture, how I could raise up the next generation. And so it was, I would probably say, a decade into my career before I really began to appreciate the leader's unique role in creating culture. And even then, I didn't have language for it. So I'm thankful that we now have a point of view that we can actually articulate.
You're speaking our language, Mark. Also in the book, you write there's 3 conditions or qualities that need to exist for a culture to qualify as a high performance culture. Can you talk just a little bit about what those qualities or conditions are?
Yes. The first is alignment. You need to have the vast majority of people in alignment with the cultural aspirations. That's one indicator of strength. Not how bad the leaders want it, but how much do the people actually buy into the cultural aspirations. So you got to have alignment. 2, you have to have performance, and you have to have performance over time. Now, we all have ups and downs, and there's the business cycle, and there are factors outside of our control, and I understand that completely. But a high-performance culture is a culture that enables performance. See, some people are confused. They think culture is the goal. Culture is not the goal. Culture is an enabler of performance.
It's a catalyst.
Every organization, for-profit, not-for-profit, military, NGO, hospital, they all are trying to accomplish something. And so culture enables performance. So you got to have performance. And then the last criteria that we established, if you really want to be a high-performance culture, is there has to be a continuing focus on improvement. Because without that, any performance that you've achieved and any strength of culture that you've been able to eke out, it's in jeopardy. Because dynamic cultures, thriving cultures, high performance cultures are never static. So those are the 3 conditions we talk about.
You know, this book is such a great gift to leadership. I think about the premise of what you don't know might be more important than what you do know. And there are so many leaders listening to this podcast today that really don't know what a high performance culture looks like. And I would encourage them to pick up a copy of this book. These principles are so important, and the way you explain them in your book are so tangible. I'd so encourage leaders to pick up a copy of the book and to compare their culture to this culture. And don't feel guilt over that when you find an area of your culture that doesn't match this culture. It's a place for improvement, right? It's a place to aspire to. And so what you don't know might be much, much more important than what you do know. And once again, many of us have never experienced a high-performance culture. And we don't have a measuring stick to even measure our culture against. And so what a beautiful gift to leaders and leadership. You know, on page 19 of your book, you talk about 3 rules that govern how to play the culture game. And And I'd like for you to expound on that a little bit, because I think they run hand in glove to your align, and then performance, and then improvement. So expound on those three rules, if you don't mind.
Sure. So again, a fun little bit of backstory. We learned a lot as we did this research. And again, scores of interviews in addition to the quant work, and on and on and on and on. So we've got a mountain of data and information. And culture's complex. I want to own that. I want to honor that for leaders that are going, this is hard. This is difficult. This is challenging for many reasons we don't have time to get into today. But we as a team were saying, can we simplify this without making it simplistic? Of course, once it becomes simplistic, it's useless.
Right.
And we debated that for months and months and months and months and months. And we actually found our inspiration from the Navy SEALs. I don't know if your audience knows their mantra or not, but it's shoot, move, communicate. And I've spent time with some SEALs. I was with one last week, and they would tell you that's not all you need to be a SEAL, but that's the essential the essential elements that you need to survive and fight another day. And when we realized the power and clarity of something so succinct, we said that's what we're actually going to try to create. And so through this mountain of research, we discerned three rules. The first rule is aspire. You must share your hopes and dreams for your culture, which sounds maybe like a blinding flash of the obvious, but I will tell you, I have met countless leaders that cannot, in a clear, simple, and repeatable fashion, share their cultural aspiration. And of the three rules, it's the first among equals, because you can't create what you can't articulate. So you have to aspire. Second, you have to amplify. You have to work to continuously amplify the aspiration. You've got to help people understand that in the midst of all the noise, that this is not going to pass. This is something you're actually serious about. And there are countless ways to amplify, but that's the rule. You have to amplify. And third, you have to adapt, which is constantly looking for ways to enhance the culture. There's a real temptation for leaders. If they have a clear aspiration and they amplify it, they'll see progress, and their culture will begin to conform to the aspiration. That's the way amplification and aspiration work together. But if you stop there, if you move into protection mode, if you try to shrink wrap it, you'll suffocate it. Because cultures are living, breathing things, and you'll kill it if you don't adapt. You've got to constantly be looking for ways to enhance your culture. So those are the three rules. And the book unpacks specific strategies and tactics that you can employ to do each of those three things.
Mark, you had I've got a copy of your book right here, and you had a great quote somewhere in the middle of the book that I underlined. It says, "I'm more convinced than ever that the right values, clearly stated, are one of the most powerful culture-shaping tools leaders have at their disposal." And that, I love that. That's why I underlined it, and I just thought it bottom lined. I thought it was in a great place, being right in the middle of the book, because it really bottom lines what it's all about.
Well, thanks for that. Let me add just a word of context to that. Values are one of those tools that leaders can use to share their hopes and dreams. But the challenge with aspiration is there are a lot of tools at your disposal. You can use vision or mission or purpose or values or ethos or whatever. I just encourage leaders, don't get caught up in the labels. What you have to do is share your hopes and dreams in a fashion that is clear, and it's simple, and it's repeatable. And for many leaders, they include values in that mix as they share their aspiration.
Mark, we primarily serve the faith-based marketplace. So churches, parachurch ministries, so on and so forth, to help build strong teams and leaders. And, we have a lot of rising leaders, a lot of young leaders in our audience. And so, over the years, if you could consolidate kind of like the best piece of leadership advice you could give, what would that be to our listener here?
Your capacity to grow determines your capacity to lead. If you can continue to learn and grow, you can continue to increase your influence, your impact, and your opportunity. Growth is it's the golden ticket.
Mm-hmm.
It's the golden ticket. Lifelong learning is what separates the very best leaders from all the rest.
Yeah, that's incredible advice and very, very wise. And, over the years, have you had mentors or leaders that you've followed along the way that have kind of helped hone your leadership ethos and framework in which now you're building into these books and into the culture over the last 45 years at Chick-fil-A?
Yeah, I've had many, many great mentors over the years, both directly in a traditional fashion, and I feel like I'm mentored by the men and women that I read their books and I listen to their podcast. So I've had many, many. I'll share one with you that reinforces that idea about growth. And the reason I mentioned this particular mentor is I think many of your listeners may know the name Dr. Howard Hendricks, who was a professor at Dallas Theological Seminary. And I think he actually taught there for just over 60 years after he graduated from there as a student. And he was all about lifelong learning and certainly influenced me greatly in that arena and others.
That's awesome. So many different mentors and, the young leaders listening as well as the older leaders that are listening here, mentors are important in our life and coaches are important in our life. And the greatest mark of strength, in my opinion, is when we're humble enough to say, hey, we need to be walking with somebody that we, can be transparent with and can speak into our life and so on and so forth. Towards the end of the book, you use a phrase called aligned by design. And we teach a principle called different by design. And it takes a look at how God's word clearly articulates to us that he has designed each of us differently. He's given us different strengths. And as we lean into those differences, what you have, I don't have, what I have, you don't have. And when those two come together, we have more. And so when I saw that phrase aligned by design, I'm like, what a beautiful phrase. But it talks more about building systems and processes to support your culture. So tell our audience a little bit more about this aligned by design concept.
Sure. What we discovered, again, back to all the work that the team did, is that the way to amplify an aspiration falls into two big buckets. Mm-hmm. One we call proximal, which is interpersonal, one-on-one, relational, and the other is the systemic methodologies where you put things in place that serve an entire culture. And what we found is that most leaders are going to have a bias, but that to do culture well, you probably need a blend, and you still need that one-on-one, that proximal interaction and connection to reinforce and amplify the culture, and you need some of the systemic things. In the book, we cite just a few of those more macro mechanisms, things like your workplace strategy, which is obviously all the rage these days in a post-pandemic world. Leaders are having to struggle with that, but that will have cultural implications, and you will amplify either your aspiration or you'll amplify something that runs counter to your aspiration in that workplace strategy. Another is strategic communications. I think it is an underutilized lever and mechanism to really, really amplify a culture. One story about that is I met with a CEO. I tell this story in the book. And he was really proud of the work their team had done on their values. And he described their process, and it was rigorous, and it was thorough. And I mean, they had just done a great job. They brought in an outside consultant, owner. I mean, they worked so hard on it. And he actually left our interview to go do orientation with new employees. And I said, "Oh, I guess you're going to tell them about the refreshed values." No, I hadn't thought about that. Like, you might want to consider that. Now, you could say, well, is that proximal or structural? Well, or systemic? The fact that it's not included regularly in orientation is a systemic problem. Like, that should be one of the 4 things or 5 things we're going to share with people. It's like, here's what we believe. Here's how we work. Here's who we're trying to become. So to me, that's just a classic example of a swing and a miss within a larger strategic communications framework. So, yeah, proximal and structural. You need to look for every mechanism possible to amplify the aspiration.
As an old marketing communications guy myself, I appreciate that last story there, Mark. The more years I spent in my career, the more I began to realize that the strategic internal communication was as or more important than the outward-facing communication. Well, Mark, you probably figured out by now that we loved the book here, and that's why we wanted to have you on the podcast. I'm just such a fan of the culture approach to leadership and how important it is. This book feels like like a handbook that leaders and aspiring leaders need in their hands. How are you? Is it releasing? When is it releasing? And is there a way to get your hands on more than one? Let's say I'm a leader that wants to get an order in bulk for my team. Talk to us a little bit about the release of the book.
Yeah, well, thanks for asking, Steve. The book is set to be released on March 7th. But we're trying something new and different. It's really an experiment. We're doing some pre-order incentives. So you mentioned if you want to provide it for your team, if you buy 11 copies, I'll do a Zoom call with your team.
Nice.
If you buy 500, I'll get on a plane and fly out and do a free keynote for you. So
I love it.
It may or may not work, but we're trying to get the book out. We want to serve leaders, and if we can't get the content out there, it's not going to serve them well. So those are some things that we're trying to do.
Well, I may just have to buy 11 more copies on March 7th, just so I can get a little more time with Mark Miller. That's fantastic. Well, it's timely when this podcast is releasing right there around the March 7th time. And whether you're listening to it then or listening to it later on in the year, we just can't recommend Culture Rules enough.
Absolutely. Mark, it's always great to have great leaders of leaders on our podcast. And I know our folks are going to be incredibly inspired by all your words. And, I like to always end our interviews with this question. Is there one question I should have asked you here on this podcast today that I didn't ask you? What would that question be?
Yeah, maybe the question is, what are my hopes and dreams for the cultures of your audience? And I'm reminded of a story. Some of your audience may have read Ernest Cline's book, Ready Player One, or seen Steven Spielberg's adaptation in the movie, Ready Player One. For those that haven't, I'll set it up really, really briefly. The hero is Wade Watts, and he lives in 2 worlds. He lives in the real world, and he lives online in a virtual world called the Oasis. And the story is fascinating about how those worlds are interconnected in this version of the future. But here's what I love is when Wade was trying to explain why people go to the Oasis, the virtual world. He said people go there because of what they can do, and they stay because of who they can become. My hope and prayer for the leaders listening to this is that you create a culture that will attract people for what they can do, the job that they can have, And then it will be so life-giving, so soul-enriching that they'll stay because of who they can become.
That's powerful words, Mark. And I pray that every listener that has heard those words would take them to heart. Mark, thank you for spending time with us today. I know you're a very, very busy man, and I really encourage every individual listening to this podcast to pick up a copy of Culture Rules. Go out, get the pre-order. I think it's a must-have read for every leader, and especially those leaders that are aspiring to lead more effectively.
Is it available everywhere, Mark, on your website? Kind of let us know specifically where you...
Well, leadeveryday.com is where you'll find the book.
Okay.
But it's Amazon, Barnes & Noble, Porch Light, Matt Holt Books. I mean, it's everywhere. Anywhere you want to go buy it, you go to leadeveryday.com to claim those incentives and bonuses for me to do the podcast and other stuff, leadeveryday.com.
Awesome. Well, thank you, Mark. We're grateful that you were with us today.
All right. Thanks for the opportunity, guys.
You bet. Till we meet again, God bless.